My name is Layla Roberts. I'm Director of Just Community Development and Investment with the Humboldt Area Foundation and Wild Rivers Community Foundation. However, I know many of you in a past role, most recently as head of our North Coast Regional Small Business Development Center, that is now being beautifully and capably led by Will Franklin, who chose just now, to go to the bathroom. There he is. My tail is wagging for the two speakers who are coming up next. Dr. Manuel and Dr. Chris Benner have been collaborating for years and years and years. We're my economic justice nerds. Who of you has this book at home somewhere, Solidarity Economics, Why Mutuality and Movements Matter? Stand up if you've actually read it. The comic counts, girls and boys, there is a comic. Buy it, take it home, print it out. One of the things that happened early on in the development of this program is one of our region's quiet geniuses, Marianne Hansen of First Five Humboldt. Where are you? Please stand up. Yeah, we're going to give you credit for this. She said, Susan, if you bring Dr. Pastor and Dr. Benner to the summit, I will pay for it. And we thought that was the best idea we'd ever heard. The Humboldt Area Foundation contributed also a little bit out of a public funding capacity building grant. And so now what we've got here are a couple of people that we hope are going to, inspire you, sure, but also I think issue a call to action. Uncover a way of thinking about your economic and business and workforce development work that makes you pleasantly uncomfortable. I love the state of productive discomfort. So please come on up. Dr. Manuel Pastor is the Distinguished Professor of Sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity at the USC. He also just... I got more babies. He also directs the University of Southern California Equity Research Institute. He holds an economics a doctorate in economics from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which is where all of my favorite radical economists come from. And his research is generally focused on issues of economic, environmental, and social conditions facing low-income urban communities. So welcome to the boonies, y'all. Dr. Chris Benner, Professor of Environmental Studies and Sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz, who is going to drive home after this. Holy moly. He is also the Dorothy E. Everett Chair in Global Information and Social Entrepreneurship. He directs the Everett Program for Technology and Social Change, and perhaps most important for our purposes, go look it up. He directs the Institute for Social Transformation at University of Santa Cruz. His research examines the relationships between technological change, regional development, and the structure of economic opportunity, which is what we're going to linger on today, focusing on regional labor markets and the transformation of work and employment. Doctors, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Great. Thanks. See the clicker. Thank you, Layla. So normally when someone says that you're following a politician, you really don't worry because they're not going to be energetic or interesting. But this was energetic and interesting. And it reminded me of when I was a young professor and I was asked to go to a big teach-in. There were going to be about 2,000 people there. It was at the beginning of the first Iraq War, and folks wanted me to talk about the economic consequences. And before I got up to speak, they said, well, we've got a guest and we just got to sneak him on right now. And it turned out it was Ed Asner, the famous actor. And instead of giving a speech, he acted out a scene from a play. And I was like, oh, crap. Like, what am I going to do afterwards? And they said, you know, you're about to come up, but there's a special guest we've got that's before you. and it turned out it was Maxine Waters, the fiery congresswoman from South Los Angeles. She's just been elected. This was going to be her first major vote. She gave a thrilling speech, and at the end she said, "And I've got a special guest I want to bring up, Jesse Jackson." And Jesse gave a pretty good speech. And then afterwards, I had to walk up. It was perhaps the loneliest moment in my life. There were 2 or 3 students of mine who were thunderously applauding, but they were pretty isolated, really. So this is not quite that bad, but he was good. So we're going to talk today back and forth. We're going to talk a little bit about weaving inclusion and prosperity. I always like to say, and Chris, some folks have seen me speak, know before I speak to let people know that if my voice breaks or tires out or is a little bit halting, you might think that it's because I'm emotional being in the Redwood Coast region with you all. After all, an urban guy getting a rural welcome. But it's not that. I've got a, though really, it is heartfelt. I've got a speech condition called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box, and it can cause your voice to break or tire out. And this is literally true. It gets treated once a month with Botox because that's how we treat everything in Los Angeles. That's pretty much works for us. So we've been through a dramatic last couple of years because with the COVID crisis, so many of us suffered physically, health-wise, ourselves, or family members. But the other aspect of this was that COVID was the disease that revealed our illnesses as a society. The racial wealth gap, such that some people didn't have an economic cushion on which to survive when employment got lost. The insecurity of legal status for so many families who, particularly in the first round of COVID assistance, got frozen out from any kind of aid. And simply the inequalities in terms of the way this disease ravaged across communities with their access to health care. All of this deep realization of the chasms of inequality in our society were exacerbated by the murder of George Floyd in 2000. And it was a murder that first led a lot of people who had never thought about policing to question the racist nature of policing, but also to begin to think about whether or not racist policing was the tip of a racist iceberg in terms of inequalities in economic opportunity, education, and even the environment. And in this context, what I think has become, I mean, in some ways, surf itself emerged from this, the sort of ravages that were made clear, the need for communities to be resilient. And it became quite clear that while there was a discussion in California about recovery, why would you want to recover to a normal that did not work for so many? What do we need to do at this moment to reimagine and restructure in a way that lifts up equity, as our colleagues were talking about, but also expands a sense of connection and commonality? So we, Chris and I, have been working on this for some years. You're right, there's a great book, Solidarity Economics. It's about to be made into a major motion picture in which Chris will be portrayed by Brad Pitt. and I will be portrayed by Antonio Banderas. So very excited about that. But we've been thinking about how do you tell a story that thinks about our changing demography, that tries to think about a new economic common sense, which we will come to, and that tries to weave across difference, weave across rural and urban areas, regions in California, weave across communities, sectors, weave between business, labor, and government. So, in order to do this, it's important to understand some of the demographic change that's going on in the country, and then we'll look a little bit at what's going on right here in your region. So this is for the United States. The United States is slated to become majority people of color by about the year 2043, 2044. As you know, that's created some degree of anxiety in some parts of the country. They are worried about an America slipping away from them. It's created delight in other parts of the country. I'm from Los Angeles, and all I can think about is that the rest of the world will know what a Korean taco truck is. And how could that actually be a bad thing? But it's fed into divisive politics, and of course, we've actually been here before. If you look at the demographic change in the United States between 2000 and 2050, going from about 67% non-Hispanic white to a slight majority people of color, that is basically the demographic change that California went through between 1980 and 2000. So California was America fast forward. And when that demographic change was occurring, particularly in the 90s, we had an era of racial propositions. Proposition 187, which sought to strip away all sorts of social services, including educational services, from undocumented immigrants in the state, banning of affirmative action, banning of bilingual education, etc. But one thing you can see that's kind of interesting is that actually demographic change in terms of ethnic shifts is actually slowing down in California. What a lot of people in the rest of the country imagine when they see that first chart is that what's going to go on is that all of the demographic change in the United States will continue to occur in California. That perhaps by the year 2050, California will become 150% Latino. Sort of super Chicanos marching the earth, declaring, hey, we're back. But you can see it's actually slowing down. The share of Latinos is projected to grow. What's the reasons for that? Our immigrant population is much more long settled, and their family formation patterns are getting closer to the U.S. norm of just having enough kids to replace yourself, your family. And what does that look like in Humboldt County? Well, Humboldt County's quite a bit whiter than the rest of the state, but demographic change is going to continue to occur here. And there's a couple things about Humboldt County. We're going to move between Humboldt, Lake and Mendocino, and the entire surf region for reasons having to do with technical data. So what do you look like when you combine Humboldt, Lake, and Mendocino? It's about 68% non-Hispanic white, so actually a lot more diverse than people think about when they think about this region. And you can see that for your Latino population, actually U.S.-born Latinos outnumber immigrant Latinos. That is, people having kids, those kids are here, people who have grown up here as well. One super interesting thing about this region is the large number of people who identify as Native, American Indian, which is the way that the census tags it, but also that group other. I am such a nerd that I spent this morning running data to look at that group other. And about half of the group that's other are people who are Native and white, Native and black, Native and Asian. So you got a big population, tribal population that's part of this picture. You could see what this looks like in terms of the map. Here the dots represent different populations, and if we had done a time series, it's a little bit harder to see. You could see the growth in the Latino population. And now what I want to turn to is the fact that your kids have already changed. Meaning, if you look at the 0 to 5 population, about 49% of the 0 to 5 population are kids of color. And you can break that down a little bit further. It's a lot of folks who are Latino, but again, you have a very large group of people who either identify only as American Indian or identify as indigenous and some other good group. So very significant. You're more diverse than the rest of the state thinks. And you're more diverse the younger you get. And that, I'm going to jump over these to get to, again, some very specific things. So you're more diverse, and you're more diverse on the younger side. And part of what that means is this chart. And what this chart looks at is the median age, half older, half younger, by race and ethnicity for Humboldt Lake, Mendocino. There's technical reasons why Del Norte's not here. But what you can look at is that for the white population, the median age, half older, half younger, is 48. For Asian American, about 36. That's about the same for the black, a little bit younger for the Native American population. The mixed population, which again is a lot of indigenous folks in the mixed or other, it's about 27. Your Latino population, median age is 26. So, 48, 26. That's 22 years. That's a generation gap. And it helps to explain two things. First, it helps to explain the ongoing demographic change. Because when you're 26, you're in prime family formation age. When you're 48, you think you're in prime family formation age, right? You may well be, Godspeed, all families are precious. But it also helps to explain an older demographic looking at a younger demographic and not seeing itself. And we can't change the demography. We have to change the way communities weave together, interact, bridge, and think about their common interests. A couple of other things about this data that I want to lift up is the legacy of the changes. So there is, when people think about demographic change in California, they think that a lot of it is being caused by immigration. And that was true in the past. In the 70s and the 80s, fully half of all immigrants coming into the United States settled in California. But now we're actually losing immigrants to other states. They're either not arriving here, or after arriving here, they're looking at housing prices and moving on. But what it means, and then despite all the political noise about undocumented immigrants, the undocumented immigrant presence in the United States peaked in the year 2007. It fell dramatically during the Great Recession as people left because there was a lack of jobs. And then it's been on a pretty slow decline since, first during the Obama years, then during the Trump years. And of course, now there's more action at the border. But what that means is that the undocumented immigrants who've been in California have been in California for a longer time. So for example, 70% of undocumented immigrants in the state have lived in the country for a decade or longer. They're deeply enmeshed in businesses, in communities, and obviously in families. They're undocumented Californians. They've sunk deep roots here. And you could see this in part by looking at mixed status families in California. The blue bar is the number of undocumented Californians, about 2.4 million, outnumbered by the number of U.S. citizen family members living with them. A lot of kids, but also aunts, uncles, cousins. And then even further outnumbered by green card holders. So this is a legacy of the past. Actually is here as well. This breaks up Humboldt and then Lake Mendocino. In Lake Mendocino, about a quarter of your 0 to 5 population has at least one undocumented parent. So if you're not thinking about how to deliver services in a way that doesn't strike fear and reluctance to engage on the part of a parent, then we're not making the investments that the center was talking about for 0 to 5 for the next generation. So a couple of other things, and then on to my colleague Cruz. This is looking at something a little bit different, shifting from the demography to the economy. And what this is looking at is basically wage growth disparity over time. And what this shows you is at the 90th percentile, 10% are making more, 90% are making less. This is for full-time year-round workers. The gray bars are the United States. The orange bars are the Golden State. What you can see here is part of the reason why we're in the middle of hot labor summer, which is first, not pictured, the 1% have totally run away from the rest of us. The share of income inequality concentrated at the top 1% is now higher than at any time it's been since the Gilded Age, the age of robber barons. In the 1960s, the average CEO made about 20 to 30 times what the average worker in his firm made. They were almost all men. Now the average CEO makes about 350 times what the average worker makes. So there's been a way in which the top has run away from the rest. But even below that, for people who are just professional workers, you can see what's going on is that if you're at the 90th percentile, relatively high wage earner, your wages went up over the last 40 years. If you were at the 75th, your wages went up as well. Maybe that's the 80th. And then basically wages fell in the middle and dropped at the bottom. And if you look at that graph carefully, what you'll see is that just as California was America fast forward demographically, California was America fast forward in terms of income inequality. We sort of accelerated more rapidly than the rest of the United States. By the way, can you tell that I like graphs? I hope you like graphs. I don't really care because I like them. And what does that look like in this area? This is just looking at Humboldt. What's interesting is your bottom has really fallen out, so is your middle, and your top really didn't gain. And we'll take a look at that in a different way in a minute. I'm going to jump over this, and I'll focus in on this, and then begin the transition to Chris. So I'm going to look at a couple things here, looking at median household income. So household income, half households making more, half making less. This is for California. And what you'll see here, and try to keep it in mind, is significant gaps between white household income and black and Latino household income. And actually pretty high income for AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander, if you know something about this population, it is the most heterogeneous of our populations. So you've got some people doing really well and some people doing very badly. So that's a broader disparity within that group than for Black Californians, Latino Californians, or white Californians. So that's what it looks like for California. Let's take a look at, again, Humboldt Lake Mendocino. Same scale. First, this region's a lot poorer. And while there's disparities, a lot of the problematic levels of income are widely shared. Second thing is to look at households with children. Here we're looking at households in California who have kids under the age of 5. And if you go back here, you could see that the white to black and Latino gap was about 95 to the mid-60s. Let's now, same scale, focus in on households with first fivers. The disparities are much larger, really sort of 2 to 1. What that means is that we are baking inequality in to the next generation. And so this is a challenge moving forward. What's that look like in this area? Again, median household income. When you look at the first 5 population, bigger gaps. I am going to transition, being aware of time, because unlike most academics, I want to actually be somewhat on time. So what are the implications? So the seeds we want to plant with you that Chris will talk more about, and then I'll come back at the end and give a stirring and emotional conclusion, is that if you look at that data, both the demographic and the economic data, you begin to realize that social infrastructure is as important as physical infrastructure. It's not just a question of the grid and power. It's a question of support in pre-K, of childcare, of elder care, because that's actually connected for a sandwich generation, of healthcare, of education. What is our social infrastructure? And the second thing that we want to lift up is that if we are to try to address that, how do we, within our regions, lift up marginalized voices that don't usually participate and are not always invited? And how do we lift up marginalized regions that get left out of the state of California equation? And I'm looking at you, Redwood Coast. Could be looking at Imperial County, too, until now they've got lithium. And everybody's like, oh, yeah, wow. So how do we make sure we're centering marginalized voices and regions that get left behind? And then how do we, and Chris will talk about this, design policy that does something very un-American? By the way, I love America, so when I'm saying this, let me clarify. It is very difficult for Americans to hold 2 ideas in their head at the same time. And the 2 ideas we want to hold in the head at the same time is that we need to focus in on equity and difference and racial equity and the experience that's different by group. And we need to build bridges of commonality, weaving together people to be able to understand their common fate. So now I presented a lot of problems with all of the answers. Chris Benner.
Well, I want to preface my remarks just by saying how much a pleasure it is to be with you here. You know, those long COVID years, extra long years, of isolation is a reminder, again, of how joyful it is to be gathering together in person. So thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I was thinking, describing his experience of following Ed Asner and Max and Jesse Jackson, and what a low point that was in his career. Manuel and I have been collaborating together for a quarter of a century now. I have lots of experience following Manuel Pastor, practically built a career on the challenges of following such an amazing speaker. But the part you may not know is that I have a particular challenge in that task of following Manuel. I have some training in economics. Some of you may have had the misfortune of taking an economics class in college or maybe even high school. So you may know that the kind of person who becomes an economist is someone who's good at numbers, but doesn't have an engaging enough personality to become an accountant. So I'm basically Manuel's straight man, I think, but what I want to talk about is the ideas in this book, Solidarity Economics. It really represents the culmination of a quarter century of work of each of us, and of course that builds on much research long before that. And that work is rooted in collaborations, conversations with community organizations, social movement organizations, unions, et cetera. So what we're presenting today is really the collective wisdom of probably thousands of people and the perspectives that it brings. And you should read the book. There's lots of great data in there. There's lots of footnotes. You should also look at the comic book. It's free to download on a website, solidarityeconomics.org. But there's really only 3 key points that are important to take away. And you can think of these as a lens on the world, right? It's a way of seeing the world in its fullness, I think. Because as we've been taught economics and what the economy is, we're actually taught with blinders. We're taught to only see the narrowest portion of the economy with an assumption that it responds to laws of supply and demand that we have no control over. We just have to adapt ourselves to these natural forces. But the first point is we have to remind ourselves it's our economy, not the economy. Yeah, it's an important concept, and it's actually hard to fully understand, right? Economies don't exist in nature, right? They're created by us. But even more important than that, like markets exist. It's not that prices don't matter, they do, and supply and demand matters, but we create markets. And we create them in ways that have values and power embedded in them. So think about, say, a market for food, right? How do we get buyers and sellers of food together? Well, we zone for grocery stores and Walmart and Costco, and that has a certain set of power relationships or values in it. Or we zone for farmers markets and giving access to local farmers to try and support a local economy. Those are 2 different kinds of markets that don't exist without, right? We can create markets for renewable energy with incentives. We create markets to incentivize conservation by different price levels in what you pay for utilities. If you think about what most of us spend most of our largest portion of our income on, our housing. Like, where is the market for housing? We zone what kind of housing can be built, where and when. Can it be in fire risk areas, or should it be affordable housing in places that are safe? Do we create reinsurance programs to insure 30-year mortgages, which enables that, but with certain characteristics to those mortgages that have created residential segregation history? So there's lots of examples of the ways that our markets are created by us in all of our economy. So we can change it. That's the key point. We are not subject to laws of nature and how our economy is structured. But here's the second point. Traditional economics emphasizes competition. And it emphasizes individuals making decisions in response to prices to get things we want and need. And it's not that that doesn't happen, but our economy as it exists today is also fundamentally built on collaboration, on mutuality. If you think about Silicon Valley and the great driving tech industry in this state, that's a collaboration between research universities, it's complexes of multiple firms, it's community colleges and training programs that are essential. It's also the baristas at the coffee shops. It's the people providing food at all the high-tech campuses. It's the people landscaping the facilities there that creates that complex in which highly skilled technical people want to live and work in that context. It's not Elon Musk that built Tesla alone. It's the policies that the state of California provided to incentivize zero-emission vehicles and that technical ecosystem that Musk was able to draw on in creating the new technologies for that. And if we don't see that mutuality, we're not going to build our economy in the way that we need. And it turns out that when we invest in that mutuality, including in more equitable outcomes, our economies do better. And that's true when you compare metropolitan regions across the US. It's true when you compare countries across the world. Those places that are more equitable grow faster and have better economic performance and better resilience. But here's the third point. Our economy exists as it is today, not by chance. It exists because some people have more power, the 1% Manuel's talking about, and others, who benefit from those structures. So if we want to create a different economy, we have to not only come together and collaborate, we got to make visible those structures of power, and we've got to figure out how to shift those structures of power. We've got to invest in that social infrastructure that can create a different future. And we call it solidarity economics explicitly. And some people have said, oh yeah, maybe that's going to be an uncomfortable conversation. You're going to turn people off using that language. But we say that because, even though this kind of solidarity building work of coming together, sharing perspectives, figuring out how we work together for the future we want to build is a critical part of investing in those movements and that social infrastructure, protests are also a part of that. Marching in the street, demonstrations, we have to expect that. If there's any engineers in the room or others who know engineers, part of what you do is put sensors on systems to see where it's not working. And that's a good thing to be able to identify, oh, there's the problems in the systems. We have to understand that social protest is a gift to us to understand what's not working. And instead of demonizing protesters, embrace and understand protesters to help us understand what's not working and how we address it. But some examples of what might we see with this solidarity economics lens in a different way than a traditional economic development lens. Well, one is we might see the importance of care work, both child care and elder care, is not just an important caring industry. It's a central part of our economy. And investing in that part of our economy is critical for our economic well-being. So part of that is our aging population. And more people are going to be needed in that elder care work. And that should be living wage, family-sustaining work. If any of you in this room are not aging, then you don't need to worry about that. But those of us who are really want to have well-paid, highly skilled caretakers when we get to that point in our lives. And childcare, as Senator McGuire talked about, if you care about the kids, okay, it's important. But if you care about having a viable Social Security system when we retire, we need those kids with early childhood education and high-quality childcare because we know that's a tremendous predictor for labor market success 20 years later. Oh, and it turns out, if you don't have high-quality childcare, parents can't go back to work in the same way. And the importance of like stories and qualitative data, we've been talking with many of the farm workers in Salinas Valley about this challenge, right? Where you can't go back to work because you're worried about the safety of your kids. Or maybe you're bringing your kids to the fields with you and they're spending the day in the car in 100-degree heat. Or maybe your high school age child is foregoing all the extracurricular activities in school and preparing for better college applications because they've got to be home taking care of the younger kids. All of those undermine our economic prosperity, right? So we might see all that with a solidarity economic lens, but we also have to understand that we have to challenge not just the need for more public investment in this, as Senator McGuire talked about, but also challenge what do we mean by skilled labor, right? Being able to wash an elder person with dignity and take care of them, that's hard work, right? Being able to inspire a 5-year-old child for lifelong learning and self-directed learning, like we know that's important, but we actually don't know how hard that is or how to recognize it. That's something we need to do. So, investing in our education system helps our economy in all sorts of important different ways. I'm going to jump over that because I think that's a little better understood. Investing in our health is critical for our economic outcomes. And of course, we've seen that in the pandemic in the ways that our lack of investment in public health and public health infrastructure led to so many of the horrendous economic outcomes that we saw in the pandemic. But also the very structure about how we think about healthcare in our society. We spend a lot of time at the moment spent on treating disease for individuals who are sick. But if we were to invest in those socioeconomic determinants of health and promote health, so we're creating healthy neighborhoods with clean air, lots of parks, walkable communities where people are outside and moving more and not having to spend so much time in their cars, we would spend less as a society on disease treatment and be healthier overall. But how do we get there? We would have to challenge the power of the medical establishment as well as the need to invest in that public health infrastructure. Climate change, of course, is huge. And we need to address climate change if we want to have a future. But climate change is also expensive, right? And this chart shows you the number of extreme weather events, flooding, hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, that are at least $1 billion worth of damage in this country. And you can see the shape of that. And that chart for 2023, we're only 9 months in, so knock on wood, there aren't more, but that bar could go up more. And of course, there are racial disparities in the vulnerability to those climate impacts. And it turns out, there's research that shows this, that where those disparities in exposure to pollution are less, overall pollution is less. Because those who are in positions of power can't externalize those pollutions to the other. But of course, we have to challenge, unfair gain from using the gifts of Mother Earth, fossil fuels and others, and challenge the companies that are benefiting from that. I want to say something about innovation. I spent a lot of time studying Silicon Valley and new technologies. And part of what we would see with the solidarity economics framework, I think, is that collective nature of knowledge production. So offshore wind, where did the technology come from that enables the high productive turbines that make that possible? It's public sector investment. Some of the key developments came from NASA. There's something called the Wind Energy Technology Center that's part of the National Renewable Energy Labs. That's a key site of technological development. We would not have that ability to produce wind energy without public investment, all of our taxpayer dollars. You know, I'm reminded too, and I put this slide together, Senator was talking about fires in the region. And I was struck by the language of the investment in more firefighters. But part of what our indigenous brothers and sisters know is that fire is a natural force. Right? And you have to learn to understand the benefits of fire. Right? Destructive wildfires come because of, in part, fuel load. And when we suppress fires for decades and decades as we've done, that's a tremendous fuel load that when the spark comes is going to become uncontrollable. But if you have prescribed burns, natural burns, to keep the fuel load low, then you understand the natural role fire plays in the ecology and for healthy plant and animals in our region. So how do we understand that collectively generated knowledge, and what is its application to our modern world today? And folks in the University of California and others are really trying to work with Native peoples to understand that traditional knowledge and to recover it and figure out what it means for today. And then the other side, of course, is how do we invest in our building and our housing in places that are not in fire risk areas, right? Affordable housing in urban centers is one of the best ways of living with fire, because fewer people are going to be living in those fire risk areas. But one of the things we have to fight in this context, coming back to the technology side, is the unfair appropriation of that knowledge. Artificial intelligence is another example we hear a lot today. I like to call that, it's basically stealing software. Because what they've done is taken all of our data without our permission on the web and photos and everything and used that to train algorithms that then companies are making profits of, right? So, part of what we need to think about is how do we talk about the safety net, right? And that's, a lot of us who care about those who are left behind and kept behind in our society, often invest in social safety net programs. But that very language assumes that people are falling into misfortune by some sense of chance, rather than structural forces that keep them there. And it neglects the ways that we all are contributing in some way to our economic prosperity. Right? And so maybe we should be talking more about the importance of social wage, an earned return on the care work we do in our families and our communities, on the way that collective knowledge, collective resources is critical for our economic future, and that we all should have some kind of benefit from that. But of course, challenging these dominant narratives, both of individual responsibility and social safety net programs, to talk about a right to housing, to a livelihood, to a basic minimum existence. I wanted to give one example in some of the surf work I'm involved with in the Central Coast in Salinas, where part of what we're thinking about with the surf opportunity is how to disrupt traditional economic practices and lift up non-traditional practices. And part of that is then figuring out how do you invest in movements as you're trying to address equity issues. So we spent a lot of time talking about the value of workforce development. Training, it's hard to be opposed to that. But when you think about it, that whole concept of workforce development is a deficit. It assumes there are job seekers who lack something in order for them to be productive members of the labor market. And when we talk about a workforce development, it assumes that there's a system to meet that gap, rather than what's actually a very fragmented agglomeration of multiple different programs that's hardly strategic or systemic. What we need to be talking about instead is workforce systems development. That start from the assets that people in our bring to the labor market, the resilience, the motivation, the connections, the social energy, that community-based organizations are best placed to recognize and translate into a way that employers can see, particularly employers that are willing to invest in that voice and training, and then bring in the training providers to fill those skill gaps that may exist. And so part of that is then creating training consortiums or workforce consortiums that bring together community groups with multiple employers who can help identify, okay, what are the skills gaps, but also then can provide employment opportunities for, for people seeking new jobs. So it's just one example, and there's multiple ways we're doing that around childcare and around public financing as well. So hopefully that will give you some new ways of seeing the world and seeing our economy. And for that inspiring and emotional conclusion, I will turn it back to Manuel. Thank you.
Chris and I have been working together for 25 years. We actually originally came together in San Jose around a living wage ordinance, and then kind of got joined at the hips for the last 25 years. And there's some, every bit of the journey's been great. There are some years where you feel like what you're doing is advancing things incrementally. Let's tinker with a living wage. Let's think about research on how regions collaborate. Let's lift up the instances of when equity and growth come together. And then there are some times when you realize that the moment you're in is transformational. That we in the US generally face three gigantic crises. One is this crisis of multiracial democracy. We haven't had it for very long. If you think about when the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts were passed, and yet many people are trying to sort of grab it back away. We face this tremendous crisis of economic inequality, sharper than ever before. And we face a climate crisis that is now staring us in the face in as dramatic a fashion as possible. And so what I want to suggest to you is that this isn't the time for normal work. This isn't the time for tinkering at the edges. This is the time to set a course for the next 40 or 50 years for the Redwood Coast, for California, and for the nation. And in order to do that, in order to take advantage of this fundamental moment, I want to leave you with these two thoughts. That lifting up equity means flipping the script about who speaks, who sets direction, who guides where we're going, and asking the question, who's not yet in this room, who should be, whose voices need to be here, how can the script be flipped to bring them forward? And then to understand that if that occurs, if new voices happen, that equity comes into the room kicking and screaming and shouting. The civil rights movement, it's really, now we've got this Martin Luther King holiday, and every January people remark on what a swell guy he was. He was sharply resisted, sharply detested, because he was shining a light on a system of American apartheid and lifting up the possibility of people weaving together their future, but unflinchingly pointing to racial disparities, pointing to economic disparities. And that then is the call to action. There is a famous quote. It's attributed to Martin Luther King. He actually borrowed it from someone else, like any good Baptist preacher, without any accreditation. That, by the way, is a little bit like academics. When we hear a good idea, the first time we borrow it, we remember to credit someone. The second time we put forward the idea, we forget to credit. And then the third time we say, as I have long argued. But Martin Luther King is famously quoted as saying that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And that's kind of heartening until you realize someone's got to bend it. It won't bend on its own. And the call to action is, how can you come up collectively with economic strategies that will lift up the region, that will address inequities by geography, by income, by race, and that will bridge people together. Bend it. Thank you.